A very good noon to all the attendees, and thank you all for joining this eminent foreign lecture series today. So along with me on screen, you can see Professor Dr. Vishwajay Chatterjee, Vice Chancellor for University of Engineering and Management, Jaipur, and Dr. Neale O'Connor, who is the guest and the keynote speaker for today. So thanks to our Vice Chancellor, sir, for giving me this opportunity to host this foreign lecture series. And I welcome you, Dr. Neale O'Connor, on behalf of entire IEM UEM group, and wish that today's session will be a good learning for all the attendees. So before we start the session, I'll just take a minute to introduce Dr. Neale. So Dr. Neale O'Connor is a professor and head of accounting department at Monash University, Malaysia. Dr. Neale has spent 20 years in Hong Kong, where he researched the modernization process of Chinese firms, examining issues such as performance measurement, order qualification, and trust. His speaking engagements and executive programs are in demand from international and mainland China managers. And most recently, he has undertaken factory quality audits for multinational clients and advising on operational and marketing improvements as founder of risebox.com. Dr. Neale has written 15 corporate business cases for several large multinational companies, and his cases are used extensively in over 40 university courses around the world. He is founder and editor of Tech Asia YouTube channel, which has got 20,000 subscribers right now, and his publications have appeared in several international journals of accounting, Journal of Business Research, Industrial Marketing Management Journal, Journal of International Accounting Research, Australian Accounting Review Journal, and Journal of Applied Management Studies. Dr. Neale currently serves on many editorial boards of international journals. And about a topic, I like to brief that the talk is based on extensive analysis and research in the field of sourcing shift to different countries with their reason to shift and the extent to move out with few case study lessons. So that was a brief about Dr. Neale and the topic for today. And from here, I'll hand it over to you, sir. So you may please address the attendees. Thank you.
Thank you to the organisers, and so happy to be on the platform today. I'm getting old, so what does that mean is that I don't have time for hearing case studies here and there about, oh, so-and-so moved from this country to that country, so-and-so moved from this country to that country. I approach these changes in economic developments like sourcing shifts from country to country as I want to know the big picture, and my curiosity got me into trouble that I spent last 6 months collecting all the data I can on all the companies that have moved out of China for many different reasons. So what I want to talk to you about today is what I have found in my search over the past 6 months. And that is, where have multinationals and even small organizations, where have they moved? If they've moved capacity out of China, which specific countries have they moved to? Which industries dominate this movement of capacity? And what were the reasons for the move? Is it just a trade war, the pandemic? There's many other reasons. And by the way, I count 17 in the document moves that I have gone through and I talk about today. And the extent of move of China, is there some reason or some determinants that can tell us why some companies move 100% out of China, that is closed down, and those that just move 10% of capacity out of China? Wow. So, you know, where's my interest coming from? Well, I've been studying supply chains in the region for over 10 years now, visiting factories, audited factories. And even though I have an accounting background, but I'm very passionate about operations, management, and research. So this is where my interests lie. But what we learned from last year with the pandemic and the things that were happening in this world was that, number one, we had border closures. Number two, we had gyrations and imbalances in supply and demand to degrees that we haven't seen for a long time. For example, in PPE, face masks would go from $1 US to $7 US a piece overnight. The factories that were making face masks in China, February last year, was only 10,000, but less than 6 weeks later, there were 32,000 factories making face masks. Like, you know, the pandemic, the trade war, and many other things of the last 5 years have caused a lot of disruptions in supply chains around the world. And for the most part, multinationals, they can shield themselves because they take a portfolio approach to managing their supply chains, and their footprint generally is in multiple countries, and in particular industries, they normally have multiple suppliers or multi-sourcing for any one component, especially the smartphone manufacturing product. But for the small companies that are stuck or they're in China, for them, it's a decision. If I move out of China, then that's a huge decision I have to make. I'm not a multinational where I can just move 10% from one country to another. So there's a variety of companies or in terms of size that I document this afternoon, and a variety of reasons. But you know, the whole idea, the whole context that we're in at the moment is, number one, we've got trade war legacy from the Trump years that is still ongoing. Number two, we have border closures from the pandemic. And number three, we have lots of imbalances of world trade because ships are kind of going one direction, and normal world trade requires ships to go to the US, but then to come back to Asia fully laden, but they're coming back to Asia empty often. That's causing gyrations in the cost of containers, going from normal 2,000 to 3,000 per container. Documented just a few weeks ago, $11,000 US for a container to get from Asia to the US ports. So you've got these things, trade war legacy, you've got border closures, you've got imbalances of trade. Let's see what has happened in terms of the movement of factories out of China. Here are what I'm going to talk about today are what I have publicly been able to find out. Now, many of you probably know of companies that have secretly moved, and generally for some companies, for some industries, this is a very sensitive area, and you don't want to document that we are moving capacity from one country to another, lest you know, my brand gets black banded in the country I am moving from, and that's the last thing you want to do for your sales and for your top line growth. But all of these companies have publicly documented their moves, and many of you know these companies. I know many of them. You know, you've seen these brands around, and they're pretty popular around India, Asia, USA. All right. So what have I documented? I've documented sourcing moves from 2018 right through until 2023. What do we mean by, Neale, 2023 hasn't occurred yet? How come you're documenting? Because these are planned moves that have been documented in the 10Ks of the publicly listed companies, where they have to actually describe their future 2-3 years out and what their strategic plan has for their shareholders. All right. Notice, and without surprise, Vietnam is a huge recipient in terms of the country moves, followed by Taiwan, Thailand, India, Mexico, Japan, and USA. And you can see that there's a lot of interest in Vietnam. India is still there in the top 4, and you know, India may not be the #1 recipient, but out of all of these developing countries, you know, take USA out and some of the other developed countries, India is still the largest FDI recipient in the region apart from China. So India is still benefiting in many, many ways from trade flows. All right, so where to move? I've already given you a hint that you know, the movements are as follows. Now I want to show you what this slide demonstrates is 2 types of moves. The red moves are where you move to a country where you already have an established factory, or you already have a contractor that is manufacturing for you, and all you're doing is bringing more orders to that contractor. So, Mr. Contractor, you know, you're doing 100,000 widgets for us every month. We now want you to do 200,000 for us. All right, so that's a red move. You actually move into a red ocean, whereas the blue ocean is you actually move into the country for the first time. And as you can see, there are different red and blue portions depending on which country companies are moving to. And we can look at this in more detail. What else can we see? We can see specific countries have an advantage in terms of the industries that they are receiving in terms of factory moves. Dominant industries for Vietnam is electrical and household, whereas Thailand, it's electronics and auto. For Indonesia, it's clothing and industrial. Malaysia, household and industrial. India, electronics and household. Again, very similar to Vietnam. Now, another point I want you to be aware of is that Neale, it's okay for a factory to move to India, but what we want to know is a factory move to Vietnam, is that the equivalent of a factory moving to India? Well, what we count is about 13,000 people equivalent capacity moving to Vietnam, whereas we've got 23,000 equivalent capacity of factory capacity moving to India. In some ways, India has fewer moves to it, but each move is a larger movement of capacity. Okay, so we're trying to count everything here in what is going on. Now, of course, what you've got here are the total moves, that is 150 country moves. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean there's 150 companies that have moved out of China, moved capacity? No. There's 108 companies moving capacity out of China, but they've moved to 150 countries. So, for example, if you look at Hasbro, the toy manufacturer, they have moved to India, they've moved capacity to Vietnam, Thailand, Mexico, and they're thinking about USA. So they moved to 4 countries, and that's how we got more country relocations than we have company relocations counted. Okay, so what else is important? I just want to document, and this is public documentation, that of course India being one of the largest recipients of FDI compared to Mexico, Japan, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Thailand. So India is not receiving many company moves out of China, but is still receiving the largest share of FDI in the region outside of China. Okay, 81 million FDI, more than that, billion FDI compared to China's 163. Okay, so it's half, but much more than Indonesia, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, and Mexico. All right, specific countries. Let's have a look. Now, when we say Vietnam, and we could say this about India, and I'm not an expert on India, and you can inform me and ask questions about that as we go on, but just for Vietnam purpose, it's different if we go to north and we go to south, because when you go to north, what's important is you can have a land border access to China. That is 12 hours away from Shenzhen, which is a hotbed of component manufacturing that you need for consumer electronics manufacturing in Vietnam. And so you would locate in North Vietnam if you are still dependent on components coming out of Shenzhen, so you don't have to rely on the ports going down to Ho Chi Minh City in the south and then waiting for the ship and when you unload in the ports. You can actually order a truck from Shenzhen, and 12 hours later, it's going to meet you at the Hoa Phang border at the top of Vietnam. So, there's a difference between the companies that move to North Vietnam compared to South Vietnam. And so, but, the companies that already had an established factory in Vietnam, there was 38. And so there was only 16 companies that are moving to Vietnam for the first time. Most of these companies represented by these countries were already in Vietnam. Okay, newly established in Vietnam, here we have 16. So the majority were already in Vietnam. And what I say to governments and working out their policy is to understand the FDI in terms of new investments and investments that are adding on to already existing investments because they are different motivations and there are different incentives attached to those different types of FDI. If we look at Thailand, notice a huge amount of location to Thailand, they're in the red, okay? Whereas just over a quarter were new factories, so 11 to 5. If we look to Taiwan, notice that most of the moves to Taiwan are not for the first time. All we have was Pedigo electric bikes moving out of China to Taiwan for the first time. Obviously, they're moving to Taiwan, close to the electronics ecosystem. Taiwan, very, very big on electronics, very, very big on sporting equipment, also big on bicycle manufacturing. All right, what about Mexico? You know, everyone's saying, let's go to Mexico. Why? Because we're close to USA and we can get close to the market. That's always been the attraction of Mexico. And notice a lot of companies that have moved to Mexico already had an existing factory in Mexico. So Mexico is not attracting any new companies, although they're attracting Bissell, which is the world's oldest manufacturer of vacuum cleaners. India, here we have it for the audience. Notice less than a quarter are moving for India for the first time. And now just remind you, this is what I've found publicly, and you might know that private companies that are moving to India that we haven't been able to find publicly. But notice that most of them are already existing in India, but they're actually adding capacity to their operations into India. And what I'd like to do with further research and insights is actually try and get a better gauge of the location in India that these companies are moving to. And sorry, I'm not showing you that today. All right, Cambodia, it's actually attracted a lot of bicycle manufacturing firms. Up until last year, they did had a most favored nation status with the EU, but in the last 12 months, the EU rescinded that. And now Cambodia, if you manufacture in Cambodia, export into the EU, you have to pay duties and taxes and tariffs just like imports from any other country in the region. But up until last year, Cambodia did have that attraction. Notice that a number of these factories that moved to Cambodia were bicycle manufacturing. And then we have Malaysia. I want to note two things. Bissell, the oldest vacuum cleaner manufacturer, moved from China down to Malaysia. They moved a part of their capacity. They're still in China, but out of the 6 vacuum cleaner manufacturers in the top 6, you got Hoover, Electrolux. Electrolux is Swedish. Hoover US. You got Bissell US. You have Dyson. Dyson is an English brand, and they have been located in Johor, Malaysia, using Flextronics as their contracting manufacturer for the past more decade. They've never actually manufactured in China at all. So, a great move for them to strategically locate not in China, but into Malaysia to ramp up their production. And of course, they're kind of like the iPhone of the air technology, vacuum cleaner technology, having their shops being located in high-end malls in the region. Bissell, the oldest and private vacuum cleaner, is great for Malaysia. They are actually locating in Johor, setting up a factory in Johor for the first time. Konica Minolta, Japanese, setting up in Malaysia for the first time as well. Okay, and Cooper Tires already in Malaysia. Of course, Malaysia having great assets in terms of the rubber, in terms of petroleum. It's perfect for the tire industry to expand in Malaysia, just like in India too. Indonesia, notice all the factories that moved to Indonesia are not for the first time, but for already established factories. And, Indonesian government need to think about how could they attract factories or FDI to come to Indonesia for the first time. That's a challenge for that country. So, there's a litany of industries here. I want to skip over this and we can come back to that. But of course, electronics dominates the move out of China to these other countries, followed by household, then auto. But notice that, electronics is dominating the Vietnamese and the household, just as with India. In there, India is the green. Notice it's big on electronics and the auto and industrial. All right, country of origin. Now that's the ownership of the companies that are moving. Of course, US is dominating all that capacity moving out of China, followed by Japanese, Taiwan, China. But they're moving capacity out of China for different reasons. Of course, US, we understand that following the Trump policy, geopolitical risks associated with that. But for the Japanese and the Koreans and the Taiwan may be closely connected with the USA, but the Japanese and Koreans, because they were connected with the USA and they had their own xenophobic challenges with operating in China with their brands and trying to, as you'll find out soon when I talk about the reasons for the move, you'll see that it's because they've had declining China sales on the Japanese and Korean brands in China. Xenophobic risk still alive and well for some countries operating in China. All right, so I want to move on to something that's very, very interesting, and that is the reasons for sourcing shift. Now that I've given you the context, you know, that you've got the top 7 or 8 countries that we've moved to, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, India, Mexico, you know, Taiwan. We understand we're moving to them. Obviously, these countries, many of them are huge recipients of FDI, continues to grow in the region, which is good for development. But we want to know what is the reasons for moving to one country to another, and do those reasons differ depending on the ownership of that factory, the ownership of that brand name. Okay, so I documented 17 different reasons, and we could classify them into issues from the USA, like trade war, geopolitical risks, issues from China, that is the costs rising in China, you've got xenophobic risks, you've got declining Chinese sales, but also you've got issues from the receiving country, that is policies set down by the government in the receiving country to be attractive for you to set up a factory in that country or to move capacity to develop export ingenuity engines out of that country. Okay. So here's my documentation of those reasons. Notice that issues from the USA are not the dominant. You've got issues like an already established factory, which is very, very important on the China side, cheaper land and labor. It's an incentive from the receiving country, but on the China side, issues are costlier land, production, labor, and taxes. The fall in China sales are still equally important. What you're going to see as I take you through the next few slides is that, and this is an advice I give to all industries and companies that come and talk to me about moving their factory, do not move for one reason alone. Do not move for a trade war alone. Do not move for geopolitical risk alone. There must be a combination of reasons to establish a move into a new country, especially if you're going there for the first time. And so if we add up all of those reasons, of course, Vietnam is going to dominate because most of the moves have gone to Vietnam. But the portion, Vietnam, notice that Vietnam is creating a lot of incentives to attract FDI, and that is even more than the actual push in terms of the issues from USA, that is being able to export from Vietnam for, you know, to avoid tariffs at the border in USA. And the same for Thailand and Taiwan. Notice that they are giving incentives which are actually greater than the push that is coming from the issues in USA. So we've got issues from China being kind of like a push. Issues from the USA is kind of a push as well. But as I've just shown you, that the issues from the receiving country to attract you are really, really important at the same time. So if we look at these across the countries, notice that issues from the USA, you can see that geopolitical risk is, you know, it's there, but it's not as dominant as the increase in tariffs. Now, for some countries, it's dominating, and, you know, India, 82% versus 18%, similar to Vietnam, 79% versus 21%. But if we look at the issues from China, notice that, and that is the push, all right? So any issues from China is pushing you to move capacity out of China to another country. And then we can say cost of that land is pushing the move from China to Vietnam. But for to go to India, it's the fall in China's sales that is pushing you to move capacity from China into India. So, there's different horses for courses here. There are different reasons depending on which country that movement is going to. And then issues from the receiving country, what is dominating is the already established factory, okay? And, that blue ocean strategy of going to a country for the first time is not necessarily a dominant strategy for most of the moves that I have documented. All right, just finishing up my talk here, and I want to leave time for questions, and that is, can we apply some analytics to all this data? It's great to see two-dimensional graphs, but as you see now, I've just shown you a dozen or more of those graphs, and you can lose the sense of, well, what's going on? What's the final point, Neale? What's the final takeaway? We need something like a multiplicative model to get a sense of which is stronger, which is weaker. Well, what I've done here is I've ran logistical regressions here, that is tried to predict based on these 17 reasons whether that would predict a move to Vietnam or not, whether it would predict a move to Thailand or not, or to India or not. Well, we can start with Vietnam, and notice in the green is something that is very special to Vietnam. So the percentage shift, if the percent shifter is larger, it's likely we could predict that the capacity is going to Vietnam versus all the other countries that I've documented. If the date of the relocation is more recent than 2018, we could predict that it's more likely to go to Vietnam rather than to other countries. All right. How does that mean what does that mean for Taiwan? Well, Taiwan, the best predictor that predicts Taiwan is whether the company is US owned and whether there are tax incentives provided by as a reason for the move. And that is a big engine that is actually predicting the move to Taiwan. What about predicting the move to India? Definitely it's the fall in China's sales, and it's the scope to improve the supply chain. And you're probably, Neale, what do you mean scope to improve the supply chain? I thought, there's parts of India which are quite modern, but there's lots of improvement. There's lots of improvement needed in terms of the infrastructure and the logistical support. We understand that. So scope to improve the supply chain, if we are moving to the country for the next decade or 2 decades, then obviously India has that scope for improvement. And that's something that I think is very special, that my algorithms are saying that is predicting the move to India versus to the other countries. So I just want to show you that I've tried to run some of these and to get some sense of, is there a dominant reason out of these 17 that is predicting a move to a particular country if some of that capacity move is moved out of China? All right, so finally, before we go to question time, we can talk about the extent of move out of China. And you're probably thinking, well, how many moved out of the 108? Well, less than, I count 14. 14 companies out of 108 moved 100% out of China. That is, they closed up. And we can understand Kia Motors closing up, xenophobic risks. We can understand probably similar issues with Japan as well. Definitely the fall in China's sales associated with xenophobic risk. But we can also talk about some of these USA companies. Harley Davidson were in the process of 2017, 18, 19, setting up a factory in China. They haven't even made a motorcycle, and then they decided, no, we're just going to close the factory before we even produce, and they moved out of China. So you know, these companies were at different stages of production, and for different reasons, they have decided, no, China is not for us in the future. But notice there's only 14 out of 108, only 9 US companies out of 108. Okay, so you're talking about 7%. When we talk about the moves out of China, then out of the 108, minus 14, so therefore you've got a 94. 94, they've just moved a percentage out of China. All right, so is there some way of predicting the extent of that move? Well, we can predict that, the percentage shift, and that is, that percentage is higher if it's a US-owned company. That percentage is higher if the global workforce is larger. That percentage is higher if we're moving to Vietnam. That percentage is higher if the date of relocation is 2020, 21, 22, rather than 2018 or 19. That percentage is higher if it's a result of a fall in China sales. That percentage is higher if we're moving to a country which has cheaper land and labor. And finally, also if there's tax incentives from that country. So just summarizing now, I'll just bring to the end here. Where to move? Okay, Vietnam dominates partial moves, and the north-south, it matters, it depends, right? You don't just move to Vietnam. Moving to the north is different from moving to the south. US-owned companies dominate 100% shift. Already established factories dominate most of the moves, and industries, electronics, household, audio, dominate the move. Electronics, auto dominate the move to India. Sports dominate the move to Taiwan. Bicycles dominate the move to Cambodia. The reasons, as I've summarized, there are a lot of different reasons, but based on my analytics, US ownership, the size, fall in China sales, xenophobic risk, cheaper land and labor, helps us predict whether we move to Thailand. Fall in China sales, scope to improve, the move to India. Notice that one, I understand our audience, mostly India today. Percentage shift out of China, Vietnam is predicting that data relocation, fall in China sales, dependency on China. Some of the cases that are coming out that I've documented is that, you know, North and South Vietnam are different, but if we talk about geopolitics and tariffs, and this may be an opportunity for India with apparel and geopolitics. Both China and India produce about 6 million tons of cotton per year. However, the Xinjiang region of China produces 5 million tons out of China's 6 million tons. And so you have challenges like Uniqlo having their shipment of apparel stopped at the US border, with the customs accusing Uniqlo of using Xinjiang cotton. And then Uniqlo saying, no, it's from the other areas of China. But you are guilty until proven innocent in the eyes of the US border security. So that's the challenge. And that's an opportunity for India to actually grab a greater slice of that apparel pie because of this geopolitical risk being placed on China by the USA. All right, so, you know, bikes in Cambodia, vacuum cleaners, I told you the story of Bissell, the oldest and privately, like it's over 125 years old for a vacuum cleaner company. That is amazing. They have set up in Johor, basically near Dyson. They moved out of China, moved capacity out of China. They're still in China, but they moved to Malaysia and Mexico. Vacuum cleaner manufacturing. Contract manufacturing dominates a lot of the moves. It's not like when I move to India or when I move to Malaysia or Vietnam, it's not like I go and build a new factory. It may be we do what Apple does. That is, Apple says to Foxconn, please go and build a factory in Vietnam because we want to expand our contract manufacturing in Vietnam. And that's what they do. You know, Bissell, I'm sure, is doing contract manufacturing in Malaysia. And so contract manufacturing enables these moves to be smarter and more fluid than what would require you to set up a factory from scratch. And in these times of border closures, that is nearly impossible to do, because you've got to send engineering teams in to supervise to make sure all the specs are set up properly for the factory build. So let me just stop there and appreciate your school and the audience for giving me time to speak to you today, and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Professor, hello, sir. That was a wonderful lecture. Just a minute, sir. So, Professor Gurnani, are you there?
Yes, I am there. I'm there.
Okay, so you may kindly take over from here.
Okay. Okay, Dr. Neale, I'll start with the questions. Students have posted few of the questions. Like I'll read out first question. That is, why are very less companies moving to Brazil, Germany, Myanmar, Serbia, and few other countries?
One of the reasons for the little moves. Okay, moving to Europe is being close to a market strategy. So if going to Serbia, you actually want to be part of the auto ecosystem. Going to Brazil, that's interesting, because Brazil is a huge recipient of FDI, but moving so far away from the region, the strategy needs to be a close to market strategy. And that's probably why you don't see as many moves to Serbia or to Brazil. Obviously Serbia, then you want to be close to the auto manufacturers in Germany and other parts of Europe. Going to Mexico is the move to make if you're going to move capacity out of China, because you want to serve the USA market.
Okay. I hope the student has got the answer. And I'll move on to the second question. That is, apart from technology, low cost labor, skills, what other factors can be responsible for the sourcing shift?
Okay, as I document, like there were 17 of them, but I want the best way to understand this is in terms of the three, maybe the four areas. Okay, one is the politics. Okay, so that's out of our control, right? US slams tariffs, puts tariffs on goods coming from China, then you just got to follow that, right? All right, so that's part of it. But the big area is the incentives from the receiving country, and already having a factory in the receiving country reduces the transaction costs. So if there was any theory, we've got to come back to the transaction cost economics. When you actually move from one country to another, there are huge costs involved in resettling into a new country, retesting, redesigning, and getting the factory up to speed. You're not going to do that from scratch unless you really have a large footprint, like a multinational footprint, where you have lots of resources that you can throw at going to a country for the first time. And with your large footprint, you have the power to get the approvals very, very quickly from the specific government authorities for your factory. But if you have a small footprint, it takes much longer to get approvals, and then it's even longer to actually outfit and test and make sure the factory works. But just to answer that, there is one case where we have a small backpack manufacturing company in China. They had 4 product lines. They decided to move to Vietnam. They did not move these 4 product lines, 4 different styles of backpacks, to Vietnam. What they did do was they decided, well, we're planning to develop a 5th style, which would require them to do design, sampling, testing, focus groups, the whole gamut of getting a new product introduced into market, right? Then they decided to approach a contract manufacturer in Vietnam to actually produce that 5th style, but they continued to make the other 4 styles in China. So in other words, that move wasn't really a move out of China, but it was a kind of a growth of that company, and they grew their global footprint by actually adding a new product, a 5th product line in that 2nd country.
Okay, that was very well answered in detail, sir. Okay. So the next question that has been put up by another student is, sir, can you please give an example of xenophobic risk?
Xenophobic, yeah, real example is what happened to Hyundai and Kia Motors, because in 2019, South Korea put in a missile defense silos with the help of US technology. And so that got a backlash from China. And so a lot of the Korean brands received the brunt of that backlash. And so actually the Kia car sales, Hyundai car sales actually went off a cliff, basically went down after that. You didn't want to be seen in China driving a Korean brand. So that's a really good example of that. Another good example, just another extreme, is H&M. Like H&M, they were very sensitive. They're very sensitive because of the Xinjiang cotton. Obviously, they got cotton in their product lines, and they made an announcement that our cotton sourced from China does not come from Xinjiang, and then the H&M were actually boycotted through the social media in China as a result of that statement to the world. So, you know, when you're large like H&M, like Hyundai and Kia, the geopolitical risk is that tightrope that you have to walk. When you are small, you're a small company and you can only be in source from one country at a time, it's an economic risk tightrope that you are walking rather than a geopolitical risk or xenophobic risk tightrope.
Yeah, that was a good example, sir. And I'll move on to the next question. That is, how is IP protection responsible for sourcing shift?
That's a very good question, and I'll give you a real example of a Swiss brand power adapter company that moved from Guangzhou to Thailand, and they moved for 3 reasons. Number one was their IP risk. Number two was their labor costs, and number 3 was they felt that there was less transparency in their communications and operations with their partners in Guangzhou. Now, they moved to Thailand, and this is going back even before the area of my study, before 2018. And so and I asked them, you know, what is this IP risk? Why do you say IP risk? Well, the answer was very, very interesting. The answer was, and the CEO was telling me, he said, Neale, we looked at the website hits on our website, and we look at the source of the visitors to our website in Guangzhou, and we find that over 2 million of the visitors are sourced from Guangzhou. We do not sell our product in Guangzhou. Why are we getting visitors to our site in Guangzhou? And it's because they go to the site and they're trying to get ideas for the design. And yes, they go to Thailand. That doesn't stop that problem. But by physically moving their factory from China to Thailand helps to mitigate the opportunity for other leakages of IP risk. So for example, where tooling might be copied or stolen from their factory in Guangzhou. When they physically move that to Thailand, well, now that tooling or cannot be copied because it's physically in another country. And there are many other instances where you move to another country to have that physical separation, which gives you the strongest protection against that IP risk.
I hope the student has got the answer. And so we have one more question there. Are there any changes in the taxation policies of China affecting sourcing shift after COVID-19?
Not that I know of, and okay, a very limited knowledge of the change in tax policy in China. And from my experience, the taxes weren't changed in terms of directly affecting the top line or the bottom line of the company. And there weren't any changes in the last 12 months that I'm aware of, but what I have witnessed in the last decade, especially across the border in Shenzhen, China, was the rezoning of land. So if you had a factory that was, say, 5 kilometers from the city center of Shenzhen, suddenly you would get a notice from the local government saying that you have to move out in 3 months because we have now rezoned your factory land into residential. Or we have rezoned your land into a high-tech zone, and because we don't want your dirty manufacturing or low-end zone operations in this area of Shenzhen, and now you have to move to the far reaches of the province or of the county. So that's, if you know, when I talk to the business people that have operations in China, that is what they see the most, the rezoning of the land where you have to move. And so for one company that I've documented, they were asked to move. And so now, okay, I've got to move within China, and my other option is, say, to move to Vietnam. Well, now the transaction costs of A versus B, there's not much difference, you see. And so that was the dominant factor that we saw in what I've documented in the data that I have here today.
Okay, I think so, sir. We are done with the questionnaires, and there's one more question, but it looks like a bit incomplete question. It's by Abhishek Sen. That is, what is the importance of moving of companies?
What is the importance?
I don't think this question has been framed properly, Professor Gurnani.
Yes. That is like incomplete question.
Mr. Abhishek Sen, can you kindly clarify a little bit about your question, because we don't get it. What is the importance of moving of companies? What is the meaning of that? What do you mean to say? Importance in terms of what?
Can we unmute him, sir, once?
Please.
Just a minute, please.
Abhishek Sen.
Abhishek Sen. I'm trying to find him very quickly. Yes. So, Mr. Abhishek Sen, we unmuted you. If you would like to, yeah. Yes, you may go ahead.
I asked a question. What is the moving company if which the company situated is good going under the company is good running? So why we necessarily move the company?
Okay, so I believe his question is like, if a company is doing good, then does it move out ever? Like, does it happen that if the company is doing good, it is in profit, still something forces the company to move out? Is it a possibility? That is, I believe that is what his question is.
Correct. That is absolutely correct. Now, remember, there was only 14 out of the 108 companies that I've documented that closed up altogether, right? So the rest is just the moving capacity out of China into other. Now, it's possible some of these capacity moves could be expansion, and that's something I can need to get more data on, which kind of addresses the point that you're saying that, and like the backpack example I gave you, the backpack company is expanding from 4 products to 5 products, and so therefore they decide to expand the contract, that 5th product, to another country. And so that's an example of what the participant is mentioning. That's a very good point. And I would expect, with, China is still growing. China and India will continue to grow. So it makes no sense for you to just close up shop in China unless there are very specific circumstances where, there is xenophobic risk there. You are US owned, so it's going to, and you are really focused on other markets, and you have falling China sales. There are obvious reasons for why you would actually close up, but that portion of reasons, as I've documented, only 14 out of the 108 wasn't very frequent. But that's a very good point there. And I may just add on to that, for the most part, for most industries, China is a very welcoming place, and for the most part, US companies continue to expand into China. US companies continue to put FDI into China. It's not like, US has finished with China. What I've tried to document here is this is not a China or another country. This is more a strategy of China plus other countries footprint that I think multinationals are increasingly being aware of and increasingly taking action on.
Okay, so Professor Gonani, are you unmuted?
Yes,
Hello?
I am unmuted.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So I hope so we are done with all the questions. So we can wind up the session here. So thanks a lot. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes. I'd like to add, my knowledge of India is very, very limited. And if anyone in the audience has some knowledge of companies that have moved to India that I haven't documented here, I'd be happy to know about, to help, get a fuller understanding of this. There are 2 different audiences for my study. The first audience is to just help us have a greater awareness and appreciation of the importance of this region, like all the countries in this region, Southeast Asia region, in providing the ecosystem for the world's manufacturing, and that importance will not go away. And so number 2, the second audience, is to help government policy in thinking about how they can better attract FDI, better attract companies to come to their country for the betterment of growth in the region as a whole. Like I've been in Hong Kong, China, Singapore, Malaysia for the last 25 years. This is my life. And I'm just excited to just try and add to our understanding of how we can help the prosperity of this region.
Sir, you're muted. I think so. Vijay sir, you're muted.
I'm finished. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful lecture. It was really a wonderful session for all of us. We got to understand many things, and I'm sure that many questions have been raised in different minds. So even though many of those might not have been posted in the questions box, so I'm sure that attendees would like to get in touch, maybe in an email with Professor O'Connor. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the attendees, and thank you so much, Professor O'Connor, for your wonderful lecture today. So I think we are done with it now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Umesh. Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you, everyone.